Essex Boys and Mr. X by Heath Mayfield from Visual Feast Publishing. Now here is another explanation that has been compiled from previously unreleased and suppressed official documentation relating to the case. It may be of interest to followers of this particular case. It is an explosive report about the real motive which has never been scrutinised and includes a more accurate description of the sequence of events in the shootings which has never been adequately explained. There always had to be a more plausible and realistic reason for how my Darren Nichols was at the centre of a plot to kill 3 men. Now is the time to reveal it and to examine it. While sitting in a prison cell serving a short sentence, he pondered the reason that he was there at all, when he was registered as a long-time paid police informant. Darren Nichols thought he was hard done by. He'd been silly and left himself open to arrest and conviction. He felt that he could have relied on the inconvenience of one of the 2 corrupt police detective friends, as he was used to dealing with them when selling marijuana and handling stolen goods. Unfortunately, they had proven to have been of no use, as he was banged to rights guilty. Darren Nichols can be described realistically as a weasel of a man. Not only does he look like a weasel with his sharply pointed nose, but he's most certainly when it comes to his attitude and behaviour. Nichols is the sort of person who will sell something illegal to someone, and once he has secured his profit, he would immediately inform on them to the police and pick another small fee up. He was not a criminal genius by any means, but he was a sly and very cunning character who is theatrically inventive. His typical nature seemed to be that of a podgy, friendly Henry, everyone's pal, with his over-the-top "how's it going, mate?" kind of greeting and his accompanying cheesy smile and deep droning voice. Nichols knew that there was a better level of protection as a serious asset to the police if one was working as an instilled plant in some particular criminal enterprise or organisation. This was more than a common grass who passes on only what he hears. But he had not yet been at that level. He was determined to find out how he could become what was regarded as a critical asset to the police, to stave off any further prison sentences that may accompany any of his future criminal activities. To Nichols, it would always be a case of self-preservation at any cost and by any means, including the blatant framing of innocent people. At the same time that he was serving his sentence and under the guise of being future interviewed regarding minor outstanding charges, he was visited by detectives. He made inquiries of how he could be more beneficial to them as an informant. After being taken through a detailed explanation of how he could achieve his desires, he volunteered to be second as a prime police informant and spy, or mole. He was determined to gain a status of being Teflon coated and untouchable as far as his criminal career was concerned. It always kept in mind earlier British spy scandals like the Profoma affair and other incidents involving significant politicians being outed as Russian agents or double agents in the 60s and 70s, such as the McLean and Burgess scandals. What has stood out to Nichols for all of these people played both sides against the middle or against each other. In addition, they had made fortunes in the process before escaping into anonymity in Russia or some unknown location. These scandals proved to Nichols that you could get away with anything as long as you were game to try. There was always the law of escaping from any retribution concerning his criminal ways via the Witness Protection Programme, something that Nichols had thought long and hard about. It was suggested to Nichols by the detectives that he could start by befriending some heavier weight criminals with whom he was serving time or to whom he could be introduced to. It was suggested that he should try and set up a connection with a well-known criminal and used car dealer who was serving his sentence at the same time as Nichols, but in another prison. But this man was about to be transferred to the same prison and to resume his close friendship with Mick Steele, who was also there. This was the giant of a man who used steroids to help him build up his already massive frame. He was known to be an associate of some of the people who were the key holders of the bulk of the Brinksmack gold robbery. His name was Pat Tate. Nichols was never going to be able to achieve a close enough relationship with Tate during his sentence, but had been advised to befriend another friend of Tate's, Mick Steele. Steele was an intelligent crook who was also an engineer by trade. He was usually a very cautious man who was aware that he was under police surveillance. He was also known to be an associate of some of the Brinksmack conspirators, inasmuch as he had led them to a small smelting company who would be prepared to melt some of the stolen gold and treat it so it could be reintroduced for sale on the open market. This, however, had never been proven. In ingratiating himself with Mick Steele, Nichols would also get to know Jack Womes, a gentle giant of a man with a very compassionate heart. All of this was done with the sole intention of getting close to Pat Tate. It was then arranged that when they were all released from prison, Nichols would join both Mick Steele and Jack Womes in a small smuggling operation, bringing marijuana across the English Channel from Holland. These activities will be monitored by Nichols' police handlers. They hoped it could lead to the arrest of, or at least better intelligence on, the much bigger fish in the drug trade. During this period, Nichols kept doing small odd jobs around Mick Steele's home and that of Mick's mother as a way of gaining his trust further. He was also starting to ask Mick Steele to try and get an introduction to Pat Tate. Nichols was told that he could get to meet him soon enough, as Mick Steele would be doing some business with him regarding marijuana importation. This operation ran smoothly for a while, with a couple of moderate results. Then Mick Steele was approached by Pat Tate about smuggling some more profitable amounts of marijuana into Essex. They had completed a couple of runs for Tate, and he paid them only a pittance for their involvement. Now they had a connection with Pat Tate. Nichols was told by his handlers he was making good progress. He was to keep on ingratiating himself with Steele and waiting for the opportunity to get closer to Pat Tate to see where it may lead. His new police assignment stroked Nichols' ego, which was already inflated. The police were keeping the group and the operations under surveillance without busting them. Then Pat Tate convinced Mick Steele they could smuggle ecstasy from a source he had in Holland. This news certainly made Nichols' handlers' ears prick up. They knew that Tate was in league with the likes of the Blundell brothers Billy and Eddie and other major crooks. One of the marijuana shipments that Pat Tate had organised and funded went awry. It proved to be a batch of marijuana of lousy quality, and it could not be resold. Tate had borrowed heavily from serious criminal financiers, and the money included interest that would continue to accrue until it was paid back in full. Tate could therefore not recoup this money. The money had come from several criminal sources. Some individuals, such as Tony Tucker, had tipped in some cash to receive a portion of the marijuana. Tate was then partnered with Tucker in an arrangement where Tucker supplied the clubs. Then there was Craig Rolfe, some other minor investors. The bulk of the money came from the combined heavies. Tate had tried to place the blame for the useless marijuana on Mick Steele. He stood over him and went as far as threatening to kill Mick Steele and his offsiders, including Jack Womes, if they did not organise to raise the money to repay Tate's loan sharks. Mick Steele had heard through the grapevine that Pat Tate had said to some of his heavies that if Steele, Womes and Nichols did not come through with all of the money owed, then he would deliver them to the loan sharks, kneel them down in front of them and shoot them in the head. Mick Steele took the threat seriously. He was aware that Pat Tate was nosediving into extreme drug abuse and was becoming more gratuitously violent, paranoid and delusional by the day. Mick Steele and Jack Womes organised a great deal of money and gave it to Tate to help resolve the matter. Pat Tate, however, did not repay his loan sharks, and this severely concerned all those involved. Tate, at this stage, was in partnership with Tony Tucker, dealing ecstasy at a significant level. They were in cahoots with the doorman at Raquel's, a trendy nightclub in Basildon. They would distribute their ecstasy inside the clubs, and this was accepted by most of the partygoers and ravers who'd clamber for their incredible popular product. The doormen were pleased with the arrangement and could receive their little cut from the drug trade by restricting access to the club to anybody not on the list of approved drug runners. They had a good idea of who was the off-duty or young undercover policeman and who were the local grasses, and would deny them entry for one reason or another as a precaution. The runners that were allowed in were prominently those of Tony Tucker and Pat Tate's, along with one or two others. The popularity of ecstasy was so great and in such excessive demand that Pat Tate organised on his and Tucker's behalf to import a large batch of extra strength ecstasy from their contact in Holland. Tate received a loan for the exercise from one of the most feared, sly and vindictive criminal loan sharks that he knew after meeting him in prison, befriending him and acting as his minder. Whilst they were serving time together, Tate then trained him in both bodybuilding and steroid use. Keep in mind that Pat Tate had served as a minder in prison for more than one heavyweight villain with a nasty reputation. One was to be heavily involved with the distribution and sale of the bulk of the loot from the Brinksmack gold robbery. This eventually led to the murders of over 20 people who were involved somehow with the stolen gold. It is said that the individual mentioned has been responsible for most of the murders, either in commissioning them or as a financier. He may have even committed the murders himself. Pat Tate was also a friend of one of the most important members of the stolen gold players, one John Marshall, who would later be also found shot dead, ironically, in a Range Rover. He even knew the heartless and homicidal John Palmer, who was taken by surprise and also shot to death at his spacious and usually well-monitored home. The much-feared loan shark, upon his release from prison, had acted as one of the financiers of Tate's criminal ventures. Tate had usually been extremely reliable when it came to paying back with interest and on time all of the loans advanced to him by the loan shark, a known sadistic and maniacal killer. Tate did not inform the loan shark of his intentions to purchase the ecstasy. He just said it was going to be a tremendous investment that he could not afford to miss. He knew full well that he was going into competition with the loan shark and did not want to alert him. Tate had received the loan and gone ahead with the drug purchase. Everything was generally running smoothly in the overall Essex crime scene at the time, and huge funds were flowing in many directions. Pat Tate and Tony Tucker were starting to run amok and were falling deeper and deeper into the excessive and constant consumption of cocktail of hard drugs such as heroin, cocaine, early speed, ecstasy and steroids, fueling their growing aggression and increasing urges to kill. Tate and Tucker were on drug-induced and greed-fueled personal fantasy trips. They were failing to adhere to more realistic rules, thinking and behaviour. They were robbing and cheating everybody they could, including some very nasty East London villains who would not forget the pair's treachery. They were starting to owe money in all directions and were making no effort to pay it back. They treated with contempt and arrogance everybody they came in contact with. They had even taken to asking average drug users if they had any drugs on them and if they could get any at that particular time. If the person produced any drugs or sourced some from another dealer, they would take the drugs from him and immediately consume them before slapping the person about and refusing to pay him. No one argued with the known bully Tony Tucker, especially when joined by the very intimidating steroid-built gargantuan Tate, who would appear on the scene scowling and threatening. They were rapidly becoming the shite on the shoes of society. While serving the remainder of his sentence, Pat Tate had become highly suspicious of Tony Tucker's spending. After all, Tucker was looking after their combined ecstasy business and the substantial ongoing profits they were making. Tate was aware of Tucker's recent purchase of a costly property and the fact that he had paid cash for it. Tate was not aware that Tucker had taken out a huge loan of £100,000 plus interest to use as a bridging loan to buy the property. The loan was on a reasonably short-term basis, as his small empire seemed to be doing really well, and he was considered to be in a position to be good for the loan. Tucker was not aware that Tate had sourced the money for the significant ecstasy buy from the loan shark, Mr. X. He assumed that it was from more tolerant loan sharks such as the Blundells, whom he feared a lot less than Tate's financier. The Blundell brothers made us kill him gently, but not Mr. X. Although there is no doubt that Tucker and Tate were close and reliable friends to each other in the beginning, the cracks had started to appear. Distrust and suspicion had set in. Tate had gotten into his mind while partially detoxing in prison and becoming paranoid and angered that Tucker might be shortchanging him as far as his share of the drug profits were concerned. He assumed that his share was going into Tucker's new property. He informed his girlfriend of his suspicions. and went as far as getting his old friend Mick Steele to visit him in prison, where he confided in him and asked him to keep an eye on Tucker for him. He was to even question Tucker's spending if possible. On the other hand, Tucker was concerned about Tate and his other unpaid debts to Mr. X, the homicidal, spiteful loan shark. He was afraid that he would be drawn into Tate's troubles, needing Tucker to bail him out in some way, maybe financially, maybe as muscle. Pat Tate had been forewarned by his supplier, who was a known London gangster and who owned a successful bar in Holland and was well connected to the local drug barons and manufacturers, that the ecstasy that he would be receiving was explicitly made up of nearly half as much ecstasy again as that found in a regular tablet. He argued that it would be vastly increase the profits when sold, and news of its perceived heightened effects spread like wildfire. This logic appealed to Tate, who never considered for a moment that this might be just too potent for some. Tate had commissioned Steele, Worms and Nichols to go to Holland and purchase a batch of ecstasy and smuggle it back to Essex. Nichols had taken the batch of ecstasy down to a secluded beach in Holland, and Mick Steele had picked up the cargo along with Jack Worms to return across the English Channel to another secluded beach in Essex. The police were aware of this activity, as they had been earlier forewarned by Nichols of his pending involvement, wanting to cover his backside. The police had agreed to let the drug purchase take place without interference in order to see where it may lead. Much of the information made its way to the desk of Detective Inspector Ivan Dibley, who was well aware of Mick Steele and kept a close eye on him for various reasons. He would also deduce somehow, within days of the murders, that Mick Steele was somehow involved. It was not long after Tate took possession of the extra strength ecstasy and started to distribute it that the news of a young teenager celebrating her 18th birthday at home with friends had collapsed after taking one of Tate's double strength ecstasy pills. This news had made its way back to the heavies, alerting them to the fact that it was not their suppliers of ecstasy that had been responsible for the Leah Betts incident, but it was the overstrong ecstasy that was being peddled by Tucker and Tate that was responsible. Therefore, Tate and Tucker were held responsible for all the trouble and inconvenience that the upper echelons of the local crime scene were having to endure, along with the cash losses involved due to the restriction situations that were now in place. Pat Tate still had a little time to reimburse Mr. X. It had been agreed that Tate could take up to 3 months to repay the loan plus interest, which, if left till the last minute, would occur to being as much as the principal loan. But his betrayal in trying to cut into the heavies' profit from the ecstasy supply business, and to imagine that Tucker and Tate could monopolise distribution, had been too much for them to tolerate. The squeeze on Tate to repay the owed money could not in principle be applied, as he still had little time before D-Day. But in Tucker's case, he could be ordered at any time to repay in full his debt to Mr. X for the bridging loan on his property. This matter had Tucker really concerned, although he tried to hide it as best he could. Apart from telling his wife that he was feeling off colour, he was in fact privately terrified. Close to the end, he had started to spend a lot more time at home and not out socialising. It was also known that he had received a number of quietly intimidating phone calls that had him on edge. When news of the Leah Betts incident first broke, Tucker and Tate, along with others, virtually went to ground and kept a low profile, whilst also moving their supplies of drugs to safe locations. Everybody expected a call from the police at some stage. There was a considerable reduction of drug dealing in the area for a short spell, although the police already knew of the ecstasy that had been imported by Nichols and Company on behalf of Pat Tate. Due to Nichols having previously informed them of the plan, they did not have a sample. They approached the head doorman of Raquel's nightclub to see if he could get them a sample of the ecstasy that had been consumed by Leah Betts, as they already knew that Tucker and Tate were responsible for it, and the head doorman was aligned to them. At first he said he could not, but he said to have agreed on compassionate grounds to try and source a sample. A sample did find itself into the hands of the investigating police. The police believed they were closing in on the trio and would shortly be making arrests. A plan was formulated by the investigating police to try and install a plant or spy into one of the more well-known criminal organisations to simply report back to his handlers. It could not be an undercover policeman, as he would be sniffed out quick smart. It had to be someone believable who could be accepted by the experienced villains. The hierarchy of the police investigation unit was informed that there might be a candidate available for such a sting. His ability as a reliable informer was not in question, but his nerve in having to deal with such heavyweight rogues as the police suggested just might be his undoing. It was decided to use the suggested covert operative after approaching him, bringing him in for evaluation and running the idea by him. The recommended agent was Darren Nichols. The obstacle was how he could be successfully introduced, believed and welcomed by such an experienced criminal organisation. A plan was formulated by the police hierarchy to use Darren Nichols, who had been highly recommended to them by a so-called minor double agent amongst the covert tentacles of the Untouchables. He would certify Nichols as being a reliable and worthwhile asset for any of the criminal heavyweights to employ. He suited the heavies' requirement for a fresh, unknown face who was strongly recommended, reliable and staunch. The plan would require the police to sacrifice one or two of their corrupt colleagues to bring off such a risky campaign. They knew that these officers were already known to be friends of Darren Nichols and could be used to spread the word of the availability of a reliable candidate for the criminal organisation. They would simply become dispensable, merely collateral damage of the sting. Word had gotten out amongst the criminal elements as it does, and then filtered and passed on through normal tittle-tattle from the streets to the police that a reliable driver would be required soon for a serious bit of business. But the candidate would have to pass all of the requirements to be offered the job. This requirement was that any known persons that already belonged to the organisation had to be excluded. This bit of business was to be a small but clean but essential operation with very few witnesses involved. Nichols had been reassured that his involvement in whatever undisclosed business that was supposed to take place would not leave him open to any official charges from anything that he might do or be responsible for during the upcoming police sting. All that Nichols knew was that he was to be the driver for some top-shelf villains who were to be due to have some sort of dealings with another group of people. Nichols presumed it was going to be a significant drug transaction, as he did have experience in smuggling and transporting large amounts of drugs. He thought this is why he had been chosen and accepted as the driver. It was always made clear to Nichols, should he ever be discovered or suspected as being a mole, that he would be protected and safe as houses in the witness protection program, given a completely new identity for himself, his wife and his children. It would also be given a one-off handsome donation for the government to help him establish himself in his new life, living under his new identity. This greatly appealed to Nichols and cemented his resolve to becoming involved in this heavyweight police sting. It would also leapfrog him up towards the level of a supergrass, something that Nichols had always courted. He was fantasizing about being a movie-type hero and spy, such as James Bond or the like, pumping himself up with the delusions of being hero worship and sophisticated in the process. He could simply not tell anybody about the significant influential changes that were taking place in his life, and certainly not his supposed pals Steele and Worms. This is how it proceeded. The name of a suggested nominee to infiltrate a well-known oppressive criminal organisation was put forward to the police intelligence branch. This was to be Darren Nichols, who had been suspected by many of being an undercover policeman, but this is nonsense. It would be necessary to provide a photograph of the nominee to the organisation to see if the nominee was known to any of the heavies or their associates, and if he could be verified as being staunch and reliable. After the initial police inquiries, it was expected that Darren Nichols would not show up as a known entity to the heavies and their associates. He was unknown to the particular heavies and was not on their radar for any reason. He was to be introduced to the heavies by known corrupt police detectives who could then be sacrificed, thrown under the bus for vouching for Nichols as a proven and reliable driver on murder assignments. What absolutely nobody knew, apart from Mr. X and one of his beautiful trophy girlfriends, was that a chance meeting between Pat Tate and Mr. X's personal property, at least in his eyes, would be the catalyst for Mr. X's intention to murder both Pat Tate and Tony Tucker, irrespective of any monies owed by them, as he was prepared to write it off through vengeance. As far as Mr. X was concerned, Pat Tate and Tony Tucker's fates had been sealed. He was hell-bent on killing them and wanted to do so as soon as possible. His initial impulse had been to wait outside Pat Tate's address until Tate showed up. Then Mr. X would don a balaclava and jump from the vehicle they were sitting in and open up on Pat Tate with a submachine gun or a reliable automatic shotgun, meaning to obliterate him with extreme malice. Mr. X realised that his initial reaction would be a little bit too brazen and fraught with danger. He decided to plan Tate's killing. A little bit of planning and then things would be off. He secretly set things in motion. His plan was to entrap the two targets in a no-escape situation, preferably in a dark, secluded location. He would then kill them, along with anybody else who might be with them. Mr. X just wanted the pair dead. There may have been some general talk amongst criminal factions about murdering Tucker and Tate, but as yet, there were no concrete plans in place. This was to be solely down to Mr. X. He decided that he would only require the assistance of a well-trusted friend, as well as a driver, to carry out his intention. His trusted accomplice would have to play his role as a respected criminal businessman he was known to be. He would be responsible for enticing Tucker and Tate to take part in a very lucrative opportunity that would be too good for them to refuse. There was little homework for Mr. X to do and some personal reconnaissance of suitable ambush sites, the securing of a specially required vehicle and a specific type of shotgun that would be reliable and acceptable for close-up work. Then, before they knew it, Tucker and Tate would meet their destiny. Nichols' cover was to be that of a known civilian agent used as a driver by the British government in the execution of several Irish terrorists in Northern Ireland in the late 1980s and early 1990s. His forte was said to be melting away and disappearing once the assignment was over. This operative had recently been killed in a road accident. Even checks by the involved criminals, made with some of their Irish counterparts, had confirmed the existence of such a character, but nobody knew his real identity. Nichols was quietly brought into the police administration building and was introduced to some of the police hierarchy who were planning the covert operation. He was made to feel welcome, appreciated, and in Nichols' eyes, very, very important. His ego was gently massaged. After having everything clearly explained to him, Nichols excitedly agreed to sign up for the role of the covert agent. He was in his element. He would not know how or when he would be used by the criminal organisation. He would merely be on call and he'd be contacted when he was required. It mattered not what sort of illegal activity he would be involved in. He merely had to report back to his police handlers when he was to be used as the driver. All had gone to plan, and it had been accepted by the criminal group involved that they could indeed call on the services of the agent Darren Nichols, codename Smiley, when needed. Nichols had been supplied with a mobile telephone that was only to be used to accept calls from the criminal organisation. Once Nichols had received a call on the designated mobile, he was to destroy the phone. He would be issued with a new mobile phone after each piece of business had been carried out. Nichols would simply receive a call, be given instructions, and would turn up for duty. Of course, this is when he was to call his police handlers to let them know he was on his move, and they could monitor him and follow him. Nichols was obviously very pleased with himself. He said to have felt as happy as a dog with two dicks. All that he had to do was bide his time to act as normally as possible and to follow his daily routines, maintaining his relations with Mick Steele and Jack Womes.